Welcome to the Avro Heritage Museum podcast, supported by Museum Development North and Arts Council England.
Hello again from me, Chris Beswick. Today's episode is the second in our series, A History of Avro in 20 Objects. And as we did last time, I'm going to start with a few clues to see whether you can guess the year that our object comes from. John Major, George Harrison, Mick Jagger and Michael Palin were all born in this year. US President Franklin D. Roosevelt attends an important conference in Casablanca. The Mediterranean island of Sicily is invaded by Allied forces. The children's book, The Little Prince, is first published. At the cinema, you would have been able to see For Whom the Bell Tolls or Lassie Come Home. And on the radio, you probably would have been listening to Itmar, It's That Man Again. Let's go over to meet Frank Pleszak in the museum, who's going to be our guide to object number 2. I started off by asking him to reveal the year in question.
Okay, so it's 1943, and we stood outside the replica of an Avro Lancaster by a little bit of an exhibition about possibly the most famous event from 1943, which of course was the Dambusters. So what we're actually looking at specifically is a little piece of twisted and charred aluminium. Yeah, it's about 12 inches long and about 6 inches wide. You can see the rivets and you can clearly see black and possibly a little bit of the camouflage paintwork. And as nondescript as it looks, it's a highly significant fragment of a Dambuster Lancaster. And as you probably know, we made 23 of these special Lancasters for the Dambuster raids. They were all Lancaster B3s, which had Packard Merlin engines, were taken from the production line here at Woodford and converted in secrecy to carry the upkeep, which was probably better known as the bouncing bomb. The upkeep full title was the Vickers Type 464 upkeep, and so these specialised Lancasters were all known as the Lancaster Type 464. Sadly, 8 of them were lost on the raid, and another 4 were lost before the end of the war. And all of them, sadly, were scrapped by 1947. And although a few fragments have been collected from some of the Dambuster crash sites, and I believe that Guy Gibson's control column has been preserved at the Lincolnshire Aviation Heritage Centre at East Kirkby, this is the only piece of a Dambuster Lancaster ever to return home to its place of birth. But there's also an interesting connection to it as well. This fragment comes from Lancaster ED937, which was Z Zebra. It actually made its first flight here at Woodford on the 3rd of May 1943. 3 days later, it was delivered to 39MU at RAF Cologne, where some of the Dambuster configuration modifications were made. It was actually delivered to Scampton, the base of the Dambuster Squadron, 617 Squadron, on the 14th of May. It was in fact the very, very last Type 464 Lancaster to be delivered to RAF Scampton. And it was allocated to a crew of Henry Maudsley. And it was allocated to them because their previous aeroplane, which was X-Ray, was severely damaged in upkeep trials at Reculver a couple of days earlier on the 12th of May. Henry Maudsley was a really experienced Lancaster pilot. He actually came from quite a well-to-do family. They owned the Standard Motor Car Company. They actually built aeroplanes during the Second World War. And he had actually been one of the pilots selected to evaluate the Lancaster before its service, so he was really experienced in flying Lancasters. He had a crew, like all Lancasters, of 7. Their average age was only 24. So they had Henry Maudsley, he was the pilot. Michael Fuller from Reigate, he was the bomb aimer navigator. William Titherley, the front gunner from Cambridge. The wireless operator, who also managed the control of the upkeep speed, was a guy called Aidan Cottam from Canada. The navigator, who was also the guy that did the height monitoring during the raids at the dams, he was also a Canadian. That was Robert Urquhart. And the rear gunner from Toxteth was Norman Burrows. And the flight engineer who sat next to Henry Maudsley was a guy called Jack Marriott, who came from just a few miles from here, from Chinley in the Peak District. And he was actually the uncle of my neighbour, Norma Bagshaw. And it's through Norma that we've got this little artifact. Anyway, after the arrival on the 14th of May of Z Zebra, it only actually made 2 flights before the raid, which of course was on the 16th of May in 1943. And Henry Maudsley and Jack, they took off just before 10 o'clock as part of Wave 1, together with Guy Gibson, to attack the Myrna and the Ada dams. And I think Z Zebra arrived at the Myrna dam just as it was breached. So they probably saw what was happening. And then, complete with his upkeep, he continued on to the Ada Dam, where there was no anti-aircraft defences, but the location of the dam was in a deep valley surrounded by tall mountains and high trees. It made the attack very, very difficult. And Z Zebra actually made several attempts and finally released its upkeep, which exploded on the parapet of the dam. And in the famous film that was made in 1955, Z Zebra is actually shown being badly damaged in that explosion and crashing in flames. But that's not what happened. That isn't the reality of what happened. It's interesting that in Guy Gibson's books afterwards, he actually said that I saw no burning aeroplane. I saw no wreckage on the ground in flames. Z Zebra had just disappeared. So it was incredible, really. So the film shows it incorrectly, but it's interesting that Guy Gibson actually saw what had happened to Z Zebra, and in a personal letter to the Marriott family, Guy Gibson says that what he saw, he said that the aeroplane was seen to drop its load, and then the pilot was in some difficulty, and then it just disappeared. So it's really sort of quite a mysterious event, really. What we don't know is what had caused the upkeep to be released so late, and what damage the explosion had actually caused to the aeroplane and crew members. What we do know is that it actually struggled on very slowly homebound and was shot down a little bit later, killing all 7 crew members right near the Dutch border, near to the German city of Emmerich. And it had just done over 4.5 hours of flying. As I mentioned, sadly, all the 7 crew members were killed, and they were buried eventually at the Reichswald Forest Military Cemetery at Kleve in Germany, not that far really from where they were shot down. Z Zebra, the aeroplane, had only actually made 3 flights in total with 617 Squadron of about 14 hours. That's all it had flown. It was the last Dambuster crash site to actually have a permanent memorial, which was opened on the 17th of May in 2019. Norma, my neighbour, was taken over as a guest of honour, where she was given this fragment of the aeroplane in which her uncle Jack Marriott had been killed. And we're really grateful to Norma that she's actually donated it to the museum, where it has pride of place in that little bit of a Dambuster exhibition. Interestingly, at the opening of the memorial, the actual memorial was organised by a German aviation historian called Marcel Hahn and an English aviation historian called Mark Welsh. But the guest of honour on the 17th of May in 2019, which was 76 years after the event, was a guy called Johannes Dervold. And as a 16-year-old gun layer, he was credited with actually shooting down of the aeroplane. So it was quite interesting, really. So that's the story of this insignificant but highly emotional, evocative bit of aluminium.
It'd be good, Frank, to hear a little bit more about the operation. Before you do that, though, just take us back to Woodford when everything was being prepared, because Woodford did play a very important part in this operation, didn't it?
Well, as you know, the Lancaster was developed by Roy Chadwick. He was based here, or at Chadderton. So Lancasters, as everybody knows, were actually built at Chadderton in North Manchester. When I say all Lancasters, of the 7,377 Lancasters that was built, not all of them were built here. They were actually, the production of Lancasters was distributed throughout England. So the Lancasters that were built by Avro were built at Chadderton in sections, transported to Woodford, where they were assembled and test flown. And these 23 that were converted to Type 464 were all taken from the production line here at Woodford. The modifications to the aeroplanes was designed by Roy Chadwick in conjunction with Barnes Wallis, who I believed had offices here for a time as well. And he developed the V-shaped calipers that carried the upkeep. They were spring-loaded, so to release the upkeep, they sprang apart and they were rotating at 500 revs per minute anti-clockwise. So all that work, all the design was done here. I believe that the major modifications was done by Avro, but the actual installation of the calipers was done at the maintenance units. And as I mentioned earlier, Z Zebra had gone from Woodford to 39 MU at RAF Cologne, where those would have been installed. And then once it got to Scampton, there would have been more modifications carried out by the particular ground crews for that aeroplane to fully adapt it. So there was a combination of people involved in setting these aeroplanes up. And things that would have happened at Woodford as well is they would have removed lots of the armour plating. The mid-upper turret was removed to save weight. Lots of the armaments were taken off it to save as much weight as they could, because at the time this was a very, very heavy piece of ordnance it was carrying. It was about 3.5 tons, so quite a significant weight below the aeroplane. Yeah, they were done in total secrecy. I believe there was a special hangar that was top secret, and the registration numbers, Z Zebra was ED937, and prior to the mission, they would have had a /G, so it would have been ED937/G. That G indicating that it must have protected by security whilst it was on the ground and not flying. So they were that top secret. Yeah. And Guy Gibson, the leader of the raid, I think made several visits here. There's lots of good photographs of him and Roy Chadwick discussing the Dambuster operations as well, yeah.
It's a story that people think they know. They've read stuff, they've seen the film and so on. And the popular press likes things that are snazzy. So they didn't use Operation Chastise. They liked the idea of Dambusters as much sexier, wasn't it? And of course, the thing they came up with was bouncing bomb. But that actually is the wrong way of describing it, isn't it?
Well, it is, yeah. I mean, the film, as good as it is, I mean, it's a brilliant film, still is, but it was made at a time when a lot of the information surrounding the Dambusters Operation Chastise was still shrouded in secrecy. It was also given the Hollywood treatment, and I suppose there was an awful lot of information to try and pack into whatever it was, an hour and a half, 2-hour film. It was, but no, we call it the bouncing bomb, but I suppose technically it wasn't a bomb and it didn't bounce. A bounce in its simplest form is an up and down movement with no change in direction. So this clearly didn't do that. It actually skimmed, ricocheted or across the water. And the Americans did some trials on bouncing bombs where they did hit the rear end of the aeroplane and took the tail off and sadly killed the pilots involved. And then in terms of being a bomb, well, again, in its simplest term, a bomb is a device that's released, an explosive device that is released that explodes on impact or after a short timer on a fuse. So it wasn't a bomb. So some people refer to it as a mine, but a mine, again, is an explosive device that is either placed or dropped into a position that explodes either in contact or in proximity to something. So it wasn't a mine either. This was a device that was designed to explode at a certain depth, 30 feet in fact, below the surface of the water. So it was really a depth charge. The idea was that it would skip across the water above the torpedo nets, and it was rotating 500 revs per minute anti-clockwise, as I said. So it would skim across the water above torpedo nets. It would then hit the parapet of the dam, and that anti-clockwise rotation would keep it in contact with the water side face of the dam wall, and it would roll down to 30 feet where hydrostatic pistols, it had 3 of those, would explode, igniting the torpex that it was filled with. The idea that would crack the dam wall and the pressure of the water would breach it, which is what happened eventually, yeah.
And to get this to work involved a huge amount of training, a huge amount of practice. What were the technical difficulties in ensuring that once you'd dropped the upkeep, that it arrived at the dam at the right points? And how was all that worked out?
Well, I mean, it all started with marbles, I suppose, flicking across the water with Barnes Wallis. And then he did lots and lots of trials at the, I think it was some naval research centre down south where they were using simulated replicas skipping across the water. And of course, working out how much explosive to use as well. They had little dams made. They had a replica of a dam, the Myrna Dam, built at the I think it was the National Road Association Works in Watford, and that is still there. And then they did a test explosion at a little dam up in the Elan Valley in Wales. There was a little dam called the Nanty Grow that was no longer needed, so they blew that up, and that again you can visit. It's still there. Well, the remains of it is still there. So to test the amount of explosive and where to position that explosive took a lot of effort. Apart from, once they'd done all that, they had to work how to deliver it. And they started off trials with at Wellington's at Chesil Beach. At the same time, they were developing another bouncing bomb, I suppose, called the Highball, which was designed to be carried by mosquitoes against ships. Tirpitz is a prime example. That was actually cancelled. So they were doing lots and lots of trials. But I have to say, unusually, most of the trials using Lancasters and the upkeep wasn't done by the squadron pilots. That was done by Vickers, who designed the bomb, or Avro test pilots. It wasn't squadron pilots until just a few days before the actual raid. And then there was a few pilots, but not all of them, got the opportunity to release a test upkeep. I mentioned earlier that Jack Marriott's team had Z Zebra because their earlier aeroplane X-Ray was damaged, and that was because the way they judged the height was shining two light lamps down from beneath the aeroplane that came together at 60 feet, which was the height they attacked the dams. They were great at night, worked perfectly, but when they were testing them during the day, they were of no use whatsoever. So they had real problems, and they did this testing from just a few days before. On the 12th of May, they started doing these tests at Reculver off the North Kent coast, where they would fly towards the coast and release the upkeep that would skip across the water onto the shore. And there was a couple of successful ones, but even the acknowledged low flying experts really struggled getting the height down to 60 feet. And a few of them had problems where the actual splash hit the bottom of the aeroplanes, and there is footage of Jack's aeroplane getting so badly damaged. You can see the bits falling off it, and that aeroplane was so badly damaged it couldn't be used, and that's why they were allocated the Z Zebra that we have this fragment of today.
And how did they work out the point at which to drop in terms of the length from the dam wall? How did they?
Well, Barnes Wallis was a brilliant mathematician, and he had all these diagrams working out. I've no idea how he worked it out, but he worked on the distance of 400.
About the aircraft then ensure that they hit that?
Well, he knew that the angle of the aeroplane, the angle that the upkeep had to be released, it had to be released from 60 feet, with the upkeep rotating 500 revs per minute anti-clockwise, with an approach of 220 miles an hour, and then around 400 to 450 yards from the dam, it would release the upkeep that would skip, so it would hit the dam wall, and then the rotation would keep it in contact with it. So how he worked that out, I have no idea.
Did they have any aid to enable them to get to that 450 yards?
Yeah, well, in the film, they show this. It's like a bit of wood in like a catapult shape, V-shaped, where they had two uprights, and when they approached the dams, as you know, had two towers, and when they were in line with the towers, they knew they were at that 400 yards that they needed. But I'm told that a lot of the bomb aimers found those so difficult to use because, this is a 30-ton aeroplane with an upkeep rotating underneath that they were vibrating so badly they couldn't use these devices. So what they did, they used to draw with China graph pencil a line across the blister at the front of the cockpit with a bit of string and two little bits on it, and those were used as well. And some of the dams, this attacked the Ada Dam, so it did have the towers, but the third dam that they attacked was called the Zorpi Dam, that didn't have any towers, and they didn't attack it in the same way. So for the Myrna and the Ada Dam, the aeroplanes approached perpendicular to the dam at that height. For the Zorpi Dam, they had to fly along the parapet of the dam as slow as possible, as low as possible, with the upkeep not spinning, and then it would release the upkeep as near to the centre as they could, that would then roll down the water side of the dam face. These were earthen dams, so it would roll down the water side to 30 feet. So a completely different technique, and for that they didn't need any device to work out that distance from the dam.
Was there a worry that if any of the aircraft crashed but the upkeep remained intact, that the Germans could get their hands on it?
Well, yes, there was, and the aeroplanes they should have fused them in case that happened, so that if the aeroplane either lost it or the aeroplane crashed, it would explode, which it did on several of those that were shot down or crashed, except one. There was one, the pilot was called Barlow, and they were they crashed. They're not sure whether they were shot down or flew into pylons as they flew down through Holland into Germany. And when that crashed, the 7 crew members were killed, but the upkeep actually bounced free and was captured obviously by the Germans and reversed engineered in a matter of months, and they developed their own bouncing bomb. They never used it operationally, but again, there is footage on YouTube showing the trials of their bouncing bomb, which they actually span using rockets, little rockets on the side to make it spin. But they didn't realise it was spinning anti-clockwise. So yeah, they did. And there's pictures of them with the upkeep as well, the Germans. But yeah.
When you say spinning anti-clockwise,
yeah.
From what perspective?
As the aeroplane approaches the front, it would be anti-clockwise. And the idea was that once it hit the water, it would create a bow wave, like a bow wave. The upkeep would then roll up the back, and that would give it the bounce. So.
You mentioned the film, Frank, and people will remember it, I'm sure, lots of people. And at the end, there's a scene with Michael Redgrave, who plays Barnes Wallace, who actually makes a statement. It wasn't worth it. Do we know whether that's historically accurate?
It's a very difficult question. That, I mean, I do talks about the Dambusters, and I start at the beginning and I tell them what I'm going to talk about. And what I do say is that I can't decide for you whether you think this was a success or whether it was worth it or not. You need to make your own decisions on that. And bizarrely, the first question I always get at the end of my talk is, was it worth it? Well, I don't know. That depends on what perspective you look at. 56 men didn't come home out of 133 that took part. Yeah, 53 men actually died. Three were prisoners of war. There was about 1,500 deaths on the ground, and the majority of those were Ukrainian women that were forced labourers. There was a disruption to industry. It was used to supply canal water for hydroelectric power. There was lots of floodings. There was some disruption for several months. The dams were actually rebuilt in I think by September. Whether it was worth it, I don't know. But I think one of the things about it was because certainly the Myrna Dam was, it was a national treasure. It was more a morale thing as well, attacking such a thing. So I can't answer that. For me, it wasn't. I mean, there was so much loss of life. I don't think it was worth it. But that's just my personal opinion in terms of strategies, and I don't know. It's a difficult one. The other thing, what it did do though was, and this is the point that most people like to make, is the fact they had to have them rebuilt. Diverted lots of the labour force from building the Atlantic Wall away from building the Atlantic Wall to repairing those dams that had been damaged, meant that the Atlantic Wall was in such a strong position when D-Day arrived the following year. So whether or not it was successful.
And as a piece of British history, it still remains something that fascinates you.
Oh, it is. Absolutely is. It's so interesting. Yeah. I mean, the film, as good as it was made, at a time when a lot of the information was still subject to the Official Secrets Act. So it's great. And Norma, and apart from this little bit of metal, she's got lots and lots of documentation. And one of them was a letter from the film company to Jack's family saying, we are making this film. Your son will be implicated in this. Would you like to read through the script to make sure you're happy with the way that we portray it? Which you obviously were, even though it was completely wrong.
Frank, it's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.
And thank you for taking us through object number 2 in the history of Avro. Thank you very much.
Cheers. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you to Frank for telling us the story behind that Lancaster fragment in the museum. We hope that you enjoyed it. Please join us for the 3rd historical object in this series later in the year. Thank you for listening. Don't forget that if you like or subscribe to the podcast and you have push notifications enabled on your device, you should get an alert telling you when the latest episode of the podcast is available. Until then, it's goodbye from me, Chris Beswick.